in helping hurting churches. There are a lot of hurting churches out there and pastors who are troubled in different ways. Dr. Kenneth Quick has also written a book called Healing the Heart of Your Church. So, Dr. Quick and Mark Barnard, welcome to today's issues.
Thank you very much.
Let's see who's who here.
Yeah,
Mark,
who's who?
Mark, where are you?
I am out of the Atlanta area, little town called Peachtree City.
Okay, do you pastor or what do you do?
No, I function as the head of Blessing Point Ministries.
Okay, Peachtree City. Yeah, you got too many Peachtree streets there, by the way.
Well,
in Atlanta,
we got a whole town named Peachtree City.
Yeah, no, it's very confusing to people who are visiting Atlanta. But I know you're just one man, and there's probably not a lot you can do about that. But when there's 7 Peachtree streets, something needs to happen. Dr. Kenneth Quick is also with us. Ken, where are you?
I am in Columbia, Maryland, and I teach at Capital Bible Seminary.
Okay, well, thank you both gentlemen for being on with us. Go ahead, Ray. Just wanted folks to know who's speaking when they talk.
Well, Mark, let's start with you. Tell us about Blessing Point Ministries, not just what you do, but how did this ministry get started?
Well, this ministry for me got started about 7 years ago when I came across a copy of Ken's book, Healing the Heart of Your Church. I had been asked to preach in a little church over here in Douglasville, Georgia, and when I went there, I could tell something was really wrong in the atmosphere of the church. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew something was wrong. And through the course of the event, someone gave me Healing the Heart of Your Church, took it with me on vacation, and as I'm reading it, the Holy Spirit is really impressing upon me that this book is for this church. So I went back, and I had only been filling the pulpit, and they asked me to be the interim pastor, and I agreed subject to the leaders going through the material in Ken's book. And it was supposed to be 3 nights, 2 hours a night, reviewing the church's situation. It turned into something much more in-depth, much more honest. We were there 3 or 4 hours a night there. And this was a little church that we discovered, as we looked at its history, had had 3 splits in 10 years. So you can imagine now why I sensed that spirit of defeat when I went there. And now some of these leaders who had come to the church more recently were discovering their history. They didn't even know all that in the past. And as they kind of looked for the theme that tied all that pain together, they realized that they had a problem submitting to authority. And as those leaders met around that table and we prayed and repented of that non-submission to authority, gentlemen, the Holy Spirit was so thick in the room that when we stopped praying, none of us really knew what to say. We couldn't say anything. We just stared at each other and said, what in the world just happened? And it was as if the spirit of the church instantly changed. And we went on to have a kind of a corporate public service detailing what the leaders had discovered about themselves, opening it up to the rest of the congregation to speak to the issue, and people were confessing their lack of submission to authority. People were in tears. It was the closest thing to revival I've ever been a part of. And so that led to another church that was probably 10 times sicker than the first one. And again, we saw this change in the heart of the church. And by the time the second one happened, I had been in real estate for about 10 years. I thought, man, Lord, are you calling me back to ministry? Is this what I'm supposed to do? And after some period of clarification, we founded Blessing Point. Ken came along with us, which we're thrilled and great. And he's been an active friend and blessing me personally ever since.
That leads Ken to a question that I think a lot of us have had. We visited churches and had exactly the experience Mark is talking about. You go in and say, well, I don't even know the people here, but something is wrong. Something doesn't feel right in the very atmosphere of the church. So how do you even spot what are the marks of an unhealthy church? How do you know when that's happened in your own congregation?
Well, one of the things that we do at Blessing Point, one of the things I would say that we've learned is to think about the church using kind of the image of a body rather than what often happens is I think most of us are trained in seminary and in all the leadership books that we read to think of the church as a business or as an organization and not as a body. And when you think of a church as an organization, you think in terms of organizations face problems, and they're trying to solve problems. Think of the church as a body, and now you're talking about pain. And I think what we have found has really been helpful to churches is to shift the paradigm into a much more biblical kind of way of thinking about the church, where it now is a body that is experiencing pain, and you don't solve pain, you heal pain. And so when you go in, and, women are great at this. Women will walk into a church and sense what's going on, immediately. They may, again, have no words to describe it, but they can walk in a door and sense it. Men, we're usually there about 6 months, and somebody's hitting us over the head with a 2x4, and we think, something's not right here. This shouldn't be happening. But sure enough, that what we're actually experiencing is the body's pain, that it is dealing with something, that God is actually letting it deal with something that is creating pain in the context of that body. And pain in our own physical bodies is a gift from God, a messenger to tell us that something's wrong, that we need to heal. And the same thing is true in churches. So a lot of churches bear an awful lot of pain. A lot of pastors, a lot of staff members, a lot of lay leaders will bear enormous pain without and keep trying to solve problems and find that just doesn't work. And they need to kind of reframe how they think about the church, and then I think a whole other set of solutions present themselves that God has given us in the Scriptures.
The interesting question arises. Mark, you talked about the church had gone through a number of pastors and problems that some of the current people didn't know about. Is there such a thing as do these kind of problems get into the DNA of a church so that almost passed on from one generation of church leaders and from one pastor to another, so that stuff that maybe happened 25 years ago is still rippling and reverberating and sort of in the inner life of the congregation a quarter century later? Does that happen that way?
Tim,
and if so, what do you do about it?
Yeah, you're right on point. And we've worked with churches whose pain goes back to the 1800s. Things that happened at the very beginning of their church that were inappropriate, that the Lord would not overlook. And he keeps trying to bring those issues to their attention by having those kind of events repeat themselves through the history of the church. And they do not go away until the leadership takes responsibility for those sins and wounds in the life of the church and represents the church before God and seeks corporate cleansing from those kind of issues. And it's really not until then that the church can hope to experience any kind of meaningful fruit. I know you guys know that there are probably thousands of evangelical churches out there today just going through the motions of doing church. A lot of times the problems are rooted in their history, and there are ways to fix the history of a church. Our prayer really is that God would do this on a large enough scale that he would begin to change the spiritual climate of the nation, because you guys are always talking about these key political and economic issues which need to be talked about. But from my perspective, the real root, it's a spiritual problem. And to address that, we have to go back to the local church and say, what is going on in the hearts of these churches? But absolutely, the DNA, sometimes how a church is formed, we go back and hear the stories of the real stories of what motivated some churches to start. And you just shake your head and think, how could they even think that God could bless this into the future? And the poor pastor who doesn't know the history of the church 30, 40 years later comes in there, and he might completely assume it's his bad leadership. He might assume it's the elders' bad leadership. They might assume it's a program problem or a policy problem. And all the time, really what's essentially happening is that God has that church under his discipline until they address those issues.
We're talking to Mark Barnard, and he's in Atlanta, and Dr. Kenneth Quick, who's in Maryland. and these gentlemen together work with a ministry called Blessing Point, strengthening churches to soar. Can you really? I mean, aren't churches? How do I say this? I don't want to use the word doomed, but that's a bad word. I didn't use it. I just thought of it, but I thought not to use it. So don't hold that against me. But aren't churches like any other human institution? I mean, you got people, you're going to have problems.
Well, we would hope that, I think you're right, and certainly the New Testament and all the, I often have students tell me that they want to go out and start the New Testament church, and I always kind of smile and say, well, are you going to start the Corinthian church? Are you going to start the Galatian church? Which church are you going to start?
Right, good point.
New Testament church.
Yeah.
And the reality is that, being a New Testament church didn't mean that you were problem-free, because sinners inhabit your pews, and so you have issues. But we have to believe, we have to believe that in the community that Jesus Christ has created, where he dwells in the midst of it, as Ephesians 2 says, he's building up a temple, a dwelling place of God in the Spirit in the context of a church, that it is going to be qualitatively different than any other kind of community, that there are resources there and there is an impact there of his presence that makes the church different. In fact, it makes the church attractive. It's God's instrument in the world today to transform people who have been wounded and damaged by our culture and by what sin has done in the context of our culture, should come to the church and find it as a haven and as a restoration place, a growth place, a place where people are being introduced to the Redeemer. That is what God has left it here to do, and it's the instrument for that in this age. So when it ceases, yes, sinners are there, and we're all dealing with the sin issues, but when it becomes a place that produces more pain in the hearts of the people who gather than healing and restoration and growth, now we have to think that it is no longer functioning the way Christ put it on the earth to function, that we are now out of step with what Christ, who wants to dwell in our midst to manifest himself, intended the church to be and to do. And
okay.
So that's the way I see it.
Hey, Mark, what's at your website? What do you guys offer for churches?
Well, on the website, I think the most helpful resource is a little survey called the Church Scan Inventory. And you can go online. It's very nicely done on the website. Answer about 20 questions in 5 categories that are really symptoms of an unhealthy church. And it gives you a very nice report instantaneously and a web link that you can go back and refer to it later. We find a lot of folks doing this and using it as a tool to begin to discuss these kind of issues with their leadership team, because these are, when we take churches through the process that we use, the comment we often hear is, we should have talked about these things years ago. And this little tool, a church scan tool on the website, blessingpoint.org, is a great way to get the conversation started and begin to think about the real health of your church.
What's the website?
Blessingpoint.org.
Blessingpoint. Do you guys go to churches and do seminars, or?
Yeah, that's basically our ministry, is that when a church calls us, and they often are in, it gets, usually when we're called is when the church is in such pain that they no longer know what to do. All the problem solving has ceased because they none of it is working, and they have no idea what to do. And that can come from a variety of different pain sources. But
wow, why do you want that job?
Well, there's lots of good jobs.
Doctors do what they do. I think it's always, we've just seen the powerful things. I tell the people that I work with, was with at a staff meeting this morning, and I told them that I don't do miracles, but I get to see them all the time, And that's the truth, that when Christ is reestablished as the Lord of a church and a church is listening to him, as we help a church to do, to listen to what God's message is and the pain that they've been through,